The 5059 gigabyte rumor may be delayed or dead. AMD is probably raising GPU prices starting in July. There's some additional testing that gives us more information regarding FSR 4.1 upscaling on the 7000 series cards, and a driver update from AMD solving some of the problems users were having with that. And a absolutely huge news for the general gaming industry is that physical disc production will be ending in January 2028 for new games releasing on PlayStation consoles. This is official from PlayStation themselves, which also seems to tie into how GTA 6 has been having a lot of controversy around not offering a physical disc. And the PlayStation Store will be ending for PS3 and PS Vita users, which I think ties into some of the concerns around ending the physical disc production for new games. And then there's some stats regarding, okay, so are people even buying physical discs anymore? And I think that depends on the kind of game that you're purchasing. And is the general move towards that 2028 no physical disc production tied into the next generation of game consoles, which also could be costing $1,000 plus? And what does that actually mean about the future of video games? Because complexity and cost can go up, might not actually be a good thing, which could lead to decrease in the quality of games despite the better hardware. Although could handhelds kind of keep things in check? Actually, there's some controversy regarding the extremely popular Companion Cube Dbrand skin for the Steam machine, and Gamers Nexus had some interesting testing regarding the controversial choice of launching the Steam machine with only one stick of DDR memory versus two to run in dual channel. And then speaking of memory and controversy, AMD had shown off their Expo ULL RAM at Computex and had targeted a similar price. Their quote was they're expecting effectively the same price as the non-ULL versions. That seems to be inherently not true, at least at launch. We have a new Steam page up for the system requirements for Cinder City, which is recommending 64 gigabytes of RAM in this economy. And yeah, sure enough, that is the case, with minimum at 32. So yikes. Now, we're getting some interesting reports that using ZLUDA, which is like a translation layer for CUDA stuff on AMD Radeon GPUs, has added 32-bit PhysX support, which gives some performance boosts for AMD GPUs and enables some of those PhysX features that were previously not usable. Now, that's in older games, but those might still be of interest to people, so that's pretty cool. We have potentially a new screen incoming for Nintendo Switch 2, and will the Switch 2 be able to run GTA 6? Big question. And then there's been some malware concerns regarding Wallpaper Engine, and so there's an update to the removal of certain wallpapers from Wallpaper Engine. So we have a ton to talk about today. Let's get into more details. All sources will be linked in the video description. So what about this 5059 gigabyte? First of all, it had never been officially announced by NVIDIA, but we had been seeing a lot of rumors regarding this from sources who do have pretty good track records. One of the main ones being Mega Size GPU, who was recently asked, speaking of the 9GB 5050, whatever happened to that SKU? Imagine how hilarious it'd be if NVIDIA released it as a 5050 Super. And Mega Size GPU, who had been one of the leakers talking about this as a potential thing in the works, has replied with, I think it's canceled or permanently delayed. They reissued the 3060 12GB for the same segment, so the 5059GB will be meaningless for a while. Now, the 5059GB was an interesting product because, I mean, it has more than 8GB of VRAM, although only 9. However, to get to that weird 9GB capacity, you would actually cut down the memory bus width. However, by moving to GDDR7, you would actually effectively increase the overall memory bandwidth, so where it would actually be about the same, although actually increased to 336 gigabytes per second of bandwidth compared to 320 gigabytes per second for the 8 gigabyte version, because you're moving from GDDR6 to GDDR7, despite cutting down the memory bit bus from 128-bit to 96-bit. So interesting. Now, videocards.com has said that they have reached out to their own sources at AIB manufacturers to try to confirm what's going on in this situation. And they say that the AIBs they have contacted have not received any new launch details or updated schedules for this SKU. So basically, it sounds like this may have been explored as a possibility. That doesn't mean it's canceled. It also, I don't know if you can delay something that didn't really have a release date in the first place, but it sounds like it's probably at least not coming anytime super soon or anything like that. Maybe if they do a Super Series lineup towards the end of the year, it could be considered something like that. I don't know, but it looks like certainly not anytime soon. Now, on the AMD side of things, we're seeing signs that AMD has told AIB manufacturers to expect 10% higher Radeon GPU and memory bundle prices in July. Now, first of all, this is not some official statement from AMD publicly, but this is being reported by board channels, and I found here at videocards.com, the report from board channels says, recent news from the storage supply chain indicates that the graphics card industry is about to enter a new round of price adjustments due to tight global supply of graphics memory chips and continuously rising market prices. It is reported that AMD has officially issued price increased notices to several AIB graphics card partners, including Sapphire, Asus, XFX, and Handstar, deciding to raise the supply price of GPU plus memory bundles by approximately 10%. This price adjustment policy is expected to be officially implemented in July of this year. With AMD GPU and memory bundle supply price increasing by 10%, the cost of goods sold by AIB manufacturers may also increase by about 10% next month, and this will likely gradually be passed on to distributors, retailers, and the consumer market. And that's the important, this last bit is important to understand if you're just kind of receiving this news and thinking, what does it mean if I'm going to buy a GPU? So the way this process works is AMD sells the actual GPU, processor chip, as well as memory, the VRAM that goes with that, to AIB graphics card partners, who then put that on a board and put a cooler on it. Those are the people like Sapphire, Asus, XFX, etc. And so they buy that from AMD, then they sell that on to retailers and, really onto distributors, who then sell it on to retailers, and then retailers sell it to the end user. So at the beginning of that chain, there's now a 10% increase. So the stock that's already in stores hasn't been hit by that yet. Now, whether or not stores choose to raise prices on existing stock in order to, just buy, get additional funding, like buy their next round, etc., or just because they can, so certainly the price increase could hit before these actual models get into retailers, but technically these GPUs that had the increased cost should take a little while before they actually enter the retail market in stores for the end user to buy. Also, just because the increase of 10% to the GPU and memory happens doesn't necessarily mean that the actual end user would pay 10% more. It could be more, it could be less, depending on how everybody tries to deal with their own margins throughout that chain of going from AMD to the AIB manufacturer to the distributor to the retailer. And because there's other costs involved with producing the GPU that aren't the GPU and the memory, and those aren't necessarily getting a 10% increase. So, but I would say it's likely that we could see something around a 10% price increase on AMD GPUs coming at some point, most likely after July, from when it actually has to hit, although whether they choose to start raising prices early before getting that stock is another question. Now, Another big discussion around AMD GPUs has been the 7000 series GPUs finally getting access to FSR 4. And this, I've done a bunch of testing on this myself. I've tested, the FSR 3 versus the FSR 4 for both image quality and performance. I also looked at the leaked version of FSR 4 that we've had access to for a while compared to the official implementation. But Hardware Unboxed finally released some of their testing on this. It takes a lot of time to do these detailed image quality comparisons, and while I had some image quality comparisons in my testing, a lot of mine was focused more on performance, and one of the things I have not had time to test out yet that Hardware Unboxed was able to look at is how does the image quality compare on the Int 8 version that's running on the 7000 series GPUs compared to the FP8 version that runs on the 9000 series GPUs. Because while I was able to confirm that the Int 8 version certainly looks massively better than FSR 3, I hadn't yet been able to do some side-by-side visual quality testing versus the FP8 version. And Hardware Unboxed has made the conclusion that if there are any downgrades, they're extremely minor. So basically, you're getting, at least in real world use case, just playing games, you're not really going to notice any real difference between the FP8 and the Int 8 version, which is fantastic news. So really, it sounds like the 7000 series cards are mostly just getting a hit in their performance compared to the 9000 series cards when running FSR 4, because they do take more of a performance hit than the 9000 series cards do, but it looks like the end result from the image quality is at least on par, even if maybe it's not always completely identical. I'll link the Hardware Unboxed video here so you can actually take a look at all of their testing. I think it's really great. They also include some DLSS side-by-sides using preset L. And preset L is very heavy, but also looks very good. So you can kind of take a look at that. So I think following up on this would be really good if you want to look at the side-by-sides. But the end result is, it looks like FSR 4 image quality is pretty much intact on the 7000 series cards compared to the 9000 series, so it's really mostly just a performance penalty generationally. Also, there had been some installing issues, especially on Windows 10. I'd previously reported that a driver hotfix had been made available, but as of June 29th, we got a 26.6.4 driver release, which does have promised, at least, I haven't tested it myself, but promised that the intermittent install issues seen when installing AMD Software Adrenaline Edition 26.6.2, which is the one that introduced the FSR 4 upscaling, was having issues on the Windows 10 systems. That's apparently been fixed. For the 7000 series users. They're also reporting the intermittent application crash that had been observed in some games with when you use the FSR 4.1, driver override. So it looks like they've basically fixed some crashes and then fixed some of the install issues on Windows 10. So, like I said, I haven't confirmed that myself through my own testing, but at least according to AMD, it should now be safe for Windows 10 users to install. And if you had previously been seeing some crashing when trying to use the new 4.1 upscaling, maybe you're good to go now. Okay, now I understand that this story is more in the console space than the PC space, and for the PC side of things, we've kind of moved away from physical media for quite a while now. However, I think in the overall just general gaming space, the move away from physical discs on consoles is really kind of a big deal. Also, I think that their choice of January 2028 might also be telling us something about the potential release date for the PlayStation 6. So I think the fact that they're choosing January 2028 to say that they will no longer produce physical discs for new games releasing on PlayStation consoles, that probably indicates that the PS6 will not release before January 2028. Now, technically it still could, but there's been some discussion around the release date of the PS6 and that, at least on the AMD chip side of things, it's like kind of ready to go. But when do they choose to actually pull the trigger on releasing, especially given the memory pricing and all of that? So I think it would make sense for I mean, first of all, this pretty much confirms that there's probably not going to be physical disk support. I mean, maybe it doesn't confirm it, but it would be likely that the PS6 will not have a physical disk drive, at least by default. My guess would be that if it's going to have physical disk support, it'll probably be an optional disk drive that you have to buy separately. And then you could play your, backwards compatibility, use your PS5 games on your PS6. So I would imagine there'll be some kind of support available like that. But at least the console itself, I would say that this is pretty much confirming the console itself it would surprise me if it had a physical disk drive by default. But I think this is a kind of a big deal because the overall industry, for example, being able to only get PS6 games through the digital store, I think matters for the longevity of the console. For example, pretty much simultaneously with this announcement, PlayStation mentioned that the PlayStation Store for PS3 and PS Vita is phasing out, at least as far as buying new games. Now, you'll still be able to download games that you've already purchased for a while longer, and this is also, you can look into the source here if you really want to, for this is phasing into different regions at different times and things like that. But I really wanted to highlight this as a potential problem with not having the physical disk support. Because if you are losing access to the PlayStation Store on older consoles, this is sure, it's the PS3 and the PS Vita, and they've had their time. But then the PS6, eventually will be an old console, and it could eventually phase out the ability to purchase new games. Whereas with old consoles and retro gaming and all of that, those discs are still available, right? You can still buy the physical disc. So if I have a PS3 or a PS Vita, I can still buy the disc version of those games pretty much forever until, I don't know, if disc rot eventually will kill them all or something, right? But it helps with the longevity of those consoles. So that's one of the reasons why I really don't like the loss of the physical disc support. Now, there's also the argument of one of the advantages to console gaming compared to PC from a financial perspective. There's always the argument of having to pay the higher costs for online gaming. There's the subscriptions that you can are more easy to avoid on the PC side of things. Better Steam sales, etc. But one of the big advantages to console gaming from a value perspective has been being able to buy a physical disc, play a game, and then resell the physical disc to recoup a lot of the cost of playing it, or actually being able to just easily hand the disc over to friends to let them play it and things like that. So there's something nice about physical discs. And so the death of the physical disc, I mean, that'll kill the used game market, the ease of lending the game to friends, being able to buy the game, play the game, and then hand it off to other people. So there's a lot of resell it to recoup the cost. So there's a lot of downsides to this. I'm only touching on some of them. Now, the justification for this is that just physical disc sales are declining. Now, an article that I'd seen pop up on some discussions of this is coming from The Game Business. Now, this isn't new. This actually published in April of 2025, but it gave some stats at that time as far as the discussion around are physical game sales completely pointless now? Is anybody still buying them? And so while this isn't completely up to date as of 2026, and it wasn't even all the way through 2025 yet, they brought up some interesting stats here. One is that, Switch 2, well, I guess it wasn't Switch 2 at the time, but Nintendo sales are still pretty strong on physical media. But then even when talking about PlayStation games, etc., they talked about the types of games that are actually still selling pretty strongly in physical sales. Specifically, it's single-player story-driven action games or family titles. where there's actually still very strong physical media sales, at least in 2023 and 2024. So they're saying in 2023, like 45% of Hogwarts Legacy sales were physical media, 49% of Assassin's Creed Mirage sales, 45% of Resident Evil 4 Remake sales, at least in the UK, were physical media. Spider-Man 2 was actually 54% physical. Not including, although that does include console bundles, which obviously if you're buying the console bundle, that could factor into that. In 2024, there were fewer of this type of game releasing, but Astrobot was a huge release and 55% physical sales in the UK, nearly 60% physical across Europe. So that is evidence that at least in certain genres, there's still strong physical sales. Although the online shooters and mostly like online multiplayer titles are mostly digital. So it seems like there's some split in the types of games that could be being shifting at least quicker towards being digital sales. And then there's all the DLCs and expansions, etc., that are also, mostly digital sales. But it's certainly not a complete non-market to sell those physical copies of games, especially those single-player or family-style titles. And I think that that's a bad thing for the end user. So I'm certainly sad to see this go. But I guess, the writing's been on the wall that this is coming, but it's certainly looking like next-gen consoles could kind of spell the... I just hit the button on my standing desk, so my camera's probably moving position there for you guys. Anyway, that's certainly a big change to the overall gaming landscape. Also, the other big change could be how expensive the next generation of consoles is. We're seeing some... argument by game creators that $1,000 plus consoles won't make games better. It could make things worse. The argument here is essentially that by the time we got to consoles like the PS5, there's a lot of, the type of game that you want to design can already be created. So by pushing the tech even further, you're not necessarily opening up whole new types of games that can be developed, but then to take advantage of that kind of hardware and the kind of fidelity that you would be expected to justify. If you're spending $1,000 on a console, gamers are probably going to want much better looking graphics, etc. But that costs game developers time, it costs money. And so if you have to spend a bunch more money trying to develop that increased graphical fidelity, then it also can actually lead to games being objectively worse, or at least more kind of like over-averaged, homogenized. I think the argument here is like you can't sell everybody spicy food, right? So if games have to appeal to everybody, then they're not going to as strongly target those, specific niches. This is where I think a lot of indie game development has really taken off, where they can really target more specific niches in a way that AAA game developers are now kind of scared to have any kind of friction in their game. Because if you make the game too hard, or if there's a puzzle in the game, your AI sidekick character is going to immediately tell you how to solve it because they're scared of putting anybody off of playing the game. But if every game just becomes this kind of, average, just over-averaged, targeting just this mass appeal, I think you kind of lose a lot of the excitement and identity from a lot of games. And again, as game development prices go up, that can continue to be a problem. Although there's some hope that the move towards a increasingly likely PlayStation 6 handheld, Xbox has talked about maybe having a handheld. I think the cross-gen period for gaming, still targeting like PS5 and Series X, will last a long time, could mean that, game budgets could still be kind of kept in check there a little bit compared to if there was a real quick move to try to go to those more advanced consoles. But, if they're $1,000 plus, I don't think they're going to sell enough units to really target that gen without a huge cross-gen market as well. So there's all of that, kind of on a related note, there's been discussion around who the heck is going to develop Baldur's Gate 4 because Larian isn't going to do it. There's already some movement on remaking Baldur's Gates 1 and 2 with, I think, even some of the original project leads. So like a Baldur's Gate 2 co-lead designer Kevin Martin, reportedly in development at Wizards of the Coast on some full remakes of the first two entries. But how do you do Baldur's Gate 4 if Larian's not going to do it? It looks like one of the co-leads on Baldur's Gate 2, James Olin, had been approached to do this project. But he basically says that as soon as they knew that Larian wasn't going to do it, he was approached saying, "Hey, James, what do you think about doing Baldur's Gate 4? And this is the James Olin, co-developer of Baldur's Gate 2, co-lead, saying, I would fail, and here's why I would fail." Basically talking about, there's a lot of, institutional knowledge at Larian Studios, etc. But like developing this kind of game is very, very difficult at this level. And I think this is tangentially related to what we're seeing with this kind of talk about, if you're also expecting to do that kind of, these huge games at this kind of huge fidelity level that would be expected of a next generation title and things. I mean, this all just ties into, I think the game industry is at a weird crossroads right now. And I'm curious what the next decade is going to look like for the games industry, from both the software side of things and the hardware side of things, because all signs point to this next generation just being a whole different kind of thing than we've ever seen before, moving forward in generations of hardware. Now, speaking of new hardware, the Steam Machine has certainly garnered a lot of discussion, and one of the most popular I don't know how I should put it, accessories to it was the companion cube coming from Dbrand. However, Dbrand didn't ask Valve for permission to do this, and so they have had to cancel and refund orders for this because Valve has asked them to do so, because this was not done the right way. So that's kind of unfortunate for people who wanted a companion cube. I'm honestly kind of surprised Valve didn't officially do one themselves. And another kind of downside to this is that I think that we're definitely going to get a bunch of cheap knockoff companion cube stuff on Amazon and whatever from all sorts of companies. It's going to happen. But Dbrand had seemingly done a pretty nice version of this, but unfortunately didn't do it in the right way, where you need to get permission to use somebody's intellectual property before selling it and profiting off of that. So that is unfortunate all the way around. And in Steam Machine testing news, one of the biggest things was that the Steam Machine had originally been planned to ship with 2 8GB sticks of memory to reach the 16GB total, whereas apparently Valve had issues sourcing that at launch, and it was easier to source one single 16GB stick. And so there was questions over what performance impact that decision ended up having. And Gamers Nexus has published some testing on this. This source will be in the video description, but they do have a nice summary chart right at the start of the video, where you can see that in gaming tests, there are some games like Baldur's Gate 3 at 1080p low settings, where it's 15.3% faster if you were running on the dual sticks instead of the single stick. Other games not showing much impact, like Black Myth Wukong at 1080p low at 0.4%, but my guess is that they could still be more GPU limited in that situation because of just how GPU demanding UE5 is, like in games like Black Myth Wukong. Resident Evil 4, they're seeing like 10%, Outer Worlds 2, 14.7%, whereas, other games are less impact, and certainly in GPU limited scenarios, they're seeing, small single-digit percentage differences for the most part. So anyway, it certainly does have a measurable and sometimes beyond, 10% performance impact in making that decision, but I guess they just had to do what they had to do with the memory supply that they were able to get. But it's just another one of the things kind of sullying the launch of what could have been an exciting, PC if it had come in at a better price, right? Now, another kind of potentially exciting memory-related launch that has been kind of sullied by the RAM price situation is AMD EXP ULL, which they had showed off at Computex recently. basically allowing better automatic overclocking of the memory right out of the box compared to normal Expo, specifically being able to get much tighter timings on the memories. And AMD at Computex had reportedly said that they expected it to come in at effectively the same price as the non-ULL versions. Well, that seems to be objectively just not true now that they're on sale, as reported here by Tom's Hardware, showing that the Neo X version, for example, for Trident Z5 Neo X, which is the ULL version compared to Trident Z5 Neo, $700 versus $1,100 to get that version. Now, if you look at it, though, the timings are certainly faster. Now, the first three timings are the same, but 96 versus 32 on that fourth column in the primary timings. So that seems to be where, at least on the spec sheet, you see the biggest difference. Also, it seems like they're able to do it at lower voltages as well. So tighter timings at lower voltages. And I think then that's kind of the justification maybe for the significantly higher price, is that there's probably a lot more binning and work done in binning these compared to these standard kits to get these kits ready to go, I would imagine. But still what is that, $500 price increase? That's pretty steep and certainly not effectively the same price. We're seeing another kit of Trident Z5 Neo X compared to Trident Z5 Neo at $1,000 versus $560. Another kit of Trident Z5 Neo X versus Trident Z5 Neo at $620 versus $544. So that's certainly less of a egregious change. These are kits that coming in at not quite as tight of timings as these kits, which is why they're overall less expensive. And then another kit, this one with even slower timings at $550 versus $500. So it's looking like maybe you could call that effectively the same price. I mean, it's 10% more on these ones, but it's certainly looking like on the absolute fastest kits, a major price premium being charged, at least for the initial launch window. Maybe they're going to try to see what they can get away with, and if they're able to sell it, expecting the ultra high-end enthusiasts to pay that price. I don't know. A few more quick stories here at the end. I was seeing articles that there's a Steam page up for Cinder City, which I'll admit to not having really followed the development of this game, but what caught my eye is they're recommending on the PC requirements 64 gigabytes of memory, and when I checked it out on the actual Steam page, not only is that true, but their minimum requirement is listed as 32 gigabytes. Now, I am really hoping that these developers take a closer look at their optimization, or maybe just what they're listing on the Steam requirements as they get closer to launch. They're also listing, recommending a 7800X3D processor with 64 gigabytes of memory. Now, the GPU they're recommending is only an RTX 4060, which certainly feels out of place here. Now, this does seem to be from what I can tell, like I said, I haven't followed this closely, a open world kind of MMO style shooter. Now, that kind of thing can be very demanding in the CPU side of things. So maybe that's where they are going to be. We also don't know what sort of performance targets or graphic settings they're talking about here, but I'm hoping this ends up just being kind of a placeholder during development that then gets reduced, because in the current landscape, that's asking for a lot of memory. Like I mentioned in the intro, and I don't have a lot to add to it here, ZLUDA, which is a translation for CUDA. It's kind of an open source project to get CUDA implementations running on AMD hardware. Has now got some early 32-bit PhysX support. Now it's a little bit of work to get it up and running, it looks like. I haven't tried it out myself, but it does seem to show significantly improved performance on AMD GPUs, which didn't previously support PhysX. So that's certainly interesting and pretty cool that support is being developed on. Now, also, as I mentioned in the intro, we're seeing signs of a different screen for the Switch 2, a different LCD panel. probably coming from Sharp as opposed to the Innolux version that's on the original version of the Switch 2. Now, the Switch 2's screen has received a lot of negative reviews. I don't own one myself, mostly because I'm waiting for an OLED version. But so no word on whether that this alternative screen panel is actually any better. So that'll be interesting when it launches to see if it's actually a better screen, if indeed this does come to pass. It's still LCD, but there's certainly a wide variety of quality levels within LCD panels. And the one the Switch 2 launched with was pretty terrible. So if this is at least somewhat better, that could be a really nice upgrade if this is kind of a quiet update to the LCD panel situation. GTA 6 on Switch 2 apparently might have had some technical hurdles cleared, but this is all coming from rumors. So Nate the Hate, who does a lot of Nintendo leaks, has said that technical hurdles have been overcome. Switch 2 port specialists have been brought on board through subcontracting, and still hearing that it won't arrive this year. But then there are additional Nintendo insiders saying that they haven't heard it's coming, but have heard that they're working with Rockstar Take-Two to try to make it happen. So in other words, it sounds like there's probably a lot of work being done to try to get a major release like GTA 6 on the Switch 2. My personal thoughts on this is they could probably cut the graphics enough to make it run on the GPU, especially at a really low resolution with upscaling. I think that the bigger hurdle would be the CPU performance. Given just what I would expect from the CPU situation on a game with this much simulation happening in a big open world. So I think the CPU side of things is where it'll be kind of interesting. And as I mentioned in the intro, Wallpaper Engine is phasing out EXE application wallpapers from their system. Looks like you have some amount of time to kind of download that. I'll link this in the video description if you're impacted, but this makes sense. It's a major security update, and there were reports of some malware running through those wallpaper applications, so I think this is a good change, and I'm just reporting on that here in case you are affected and were using any of those. All right, that's what I've got for you guys today. Hopefully you found the video useful and or interesting, and you have an excellent day.